Anaxa's second rerun is finally arriving in version 4.4 Phase 2, so let's see how he holds up in the current meta. In this video, I'll explain how to properly build him and play him to continue using him in the current endgame. I will not go over his kit because all of that information is easily accessible within the game. I've been using Anaxa to clear endgame for a pretty long time now, so I'd say I have a pretty decent knowledge on how to use him even if I'm not the best Anaxa player, as I have played him as both DPS and sub DPS quite frequently. Disclaimer that as I am not a theory crafter, some of the information might not be entirely accurate. Now let's take a look at his current standing in the meta. Anaxa is a Wind Erudition character. As a DPS, he is currently ranked T0.5 in both Memory of Chaos and Apocalyptic Shadow, and T1 in Pure Fiction. As a sub DPS, he is currently ranked T1.5 in both Memory of Chaos and Apocalyptic Shadow, and T0.5 in Pure Fiction. Oh yeah, this is the Pride in tier list, by the way. I more or less agree with the sentiment, except that he is not that high in Pure Fiction as a sub DPS in my opinion. An important note is that Anaxa's attacks are bounce, so he is ironically not as powerful in AoE scenarios, and is instead much better in single target scenarios. This does mean he isn't that good in Pure Fiction. He is typically only used with Herda as a sub DPS, and most Herda players rather opt for Jade or Mini Herda instead for Pure Fiction. In other words, I'm telling you to not use him as a sub DPS for Herda in Pure Fiction, unless you really have no other options. I wouldn't necessarily call him the pinnacle of meta right now, but he is still extremely powerful and can easily rival some of the supposed T0 DPS as it stands right now. He has some of the cheapest clears in the endgame, making him quite FTP friendly to play him. His weakness implant is actually quite powerful in APOC as well, allowing him to cheese boss mechanics like how I did in my Flame Reaver run here, where I skipped the entire stall phase. His double skill can be triggered by his basic, making him surprisingly SP positive. In my opinion, he is still worth pulling even for meta, as now you need 3 teams for the Star Wars mode. He is still powerful enough to compete and relatively cheap to invest in. I just wouldn't recommend him for Pure Fiction. Beyond just his prowess, I personally think his team comp is also one of the most enjoyable to play. Of course, fun is subjective, but it's quite thrilling for me to try and push him to his absolute best. Let's talk about his team building. I'm going to go over his main DPS options, as that's what most people care about. He usually wants an action advanced support, and in this case his best in slot would be Cyrene. Cyrene provides an insane amount of buffs to him and recovers a skill point every time she action advances him. She can also buff Cyrene, who is part of Anaxa's best in slot team as well. I'll elaborate more on Cyrene in a short bit. However, any AA support can technically work, such as Sunday, Bronya, RMC, and Sparkle, but none of them can come close to what Cyrene can provide. His third slot is typically Cyrene. When Peerage is active, Anaxa can quadruple his skill instead of the normal double, which provides a massive amount of damage. Tying back to APOC, a quad skill can chip down a lot on a boss's bar. Cyrene also gets buffs from Cyrene. Besides just increasing crit damage for Anaxa, the most important thing is she recovers 1 charge immediately after being buffed by Cyrene. This effectively makes her only requires 5 charges for Peerage instead of the usual 6, allowing you to proc him more often on Anaxa. If you don't have Cyrene, you can of course also use another AA support or a generic buffer like Robin, but they won't receive the same benefits from Cyrene, assuming she's on the team. They're also less than ideal. Since Cyrene is rerunning, it would be a good time to pick her up for Anaxa. His fourth slot is either a sustain or sustainless. For sustain, it is typically Downhand PT, who provides attack buffs for him. Cyrene also provides buffs to Downhand PT, which allows Anaxa to deal more damage as bomb mate. Downhand PT has some synergy with Sunday, so even if you're using him with Sunday, there's still some gain. Exception would be if you're using Anaxa against Pollux, then you would need a healer, which Hyacing is the best. For sustainless, his best in slot would be RMC. RMC is a remembrance character, which means they can charge Cyrene's ult faster. Of course, using a fourth slot like Sunday and Sparkle works as well if your Trailblazer is busy on another team. The idea is that you want Anaxa to take as many actions as possible. I'm going to briefly talk about him as a sub DPS, so the only team he is realistically on as a sub DPS are Herda teams. This just means he will be the second Erudition sub DPS for Herda. As I already have a Herda video, which is ironically outdated, I won't go too deeply, but you would really only use him for Herda in Memory of Chaos and Apocalyptic Shadow. In Pure Fiction, you rather use Mini Herda as the sub DPS. Let's talk about his Lightcone options. It will be the same regardless whether he is a sub DPS or DPS, so there's no need to worry about differentiating the two. His undisputed best in slot is obviously his signature Lightcone, Life Should Be Cast in Flames. It provides ER at the start of his turn, increases his damage, and offers Death Shred. However, Herta's signature Lightcone into the Unreachable Veil is an extremely competitive option as well, and can sometimes be better than his own signature. It offers crit rate, increases skill and ult damage, and recovers SP upon using ult. In practice, this makes him easier to build because of the crit rate, and more room for error due to the extra skill point. His best F2B option, if you have none of the above, would just be the Great Cosmic Enterprise, which you can buy from the Herta shop. You can S5 it for free. Anaxa isn't as reliant on his signature Lightcone, so if your resources are spread thin, you can just use the free option without losing much. Let's talk about his Relic sets. I'm gonna talk about his DPS options first, since there are quite a lot. After finish explaining his sets, I'll compare them and give my personal input. He has 5 sets that he could realistically use. With the addition of the new Navigator set, which provides 12% attack and 18% skill and ult damage, increase every skill that can stack up to 3 times, but one stack is removed at the start of either his turn or when he ults. He can maintain decent uptime on his stack, usually guaranteeing at least a 36% damage boost, but during Peerage can max out onto 54%. If you happen to have Mornax Blade, or your current set is subpar, this could be worth considering. This set also works with whatever team comp you're running on Anaxa, so it will always have value. It offers the most consistent and strongest performance. The second set will be the Wave Strider Captain set, which is also the final set. This set increases crit damage by 16%. When you have 2 stacks of health, it increases his attack by 48%. In this case, it will be activated if Cyrene skills on him, then Cyrene ults on him. Understandably, this set could be difficult to pilot for some players, and is also harder to use without Cyrene, so it is not necessarily always the best available option. It performs slightly worse than Navigator, I believe. The third set is the Genius of Brilliant Stars, which increases quantum damage by 10% and ignores 10% defense, and another additional 10% if the enemy has quantum weakness. Since Anaxa can implant weakness, he can reap the 20% Death Shred. This set is his best in slot at lower levels of investments, and the closer your Death Shred is to 100%, the better it is, since Death Shred scales exponentially. Understandably though, this set has drawbacks. Once you hit 100%, any more is useless. This could happen if you're able to stack 100% Death Shred from himself and his teammates. An example would be E1 S1 Anaxa with E1 Cyrene in this current Pure Fiction. He has 12% from his Lightcone, 16% from his E1, 28% from his major traits, 36% from Cyrene, and additional 30% from the Pure Fiction buff. It could also be from other teammates such as E1 Sunday, E2 Sparkle, or E6 Cyrene. This unfortunately makes the Genius set useless if you're able to overcap. However, if for example you only have E0 S1 Anaxa and E1 Cyrene with no other Death Shred sources, he will be at 96% with the Genius set active, granting him a massive boost. In any case, just make sure you are properly reaping the buffs instead of just mindlessly overcapping. When min-max, it can surpass Navigator, otherwise it performs roughly equal. The fourth set is the Pioneer Diver of Dead Water set. This is the Akron set, and it increases damage dealt to debuffed enemies by 12%, increases crit rate by 4%, and deals 12% more crit damage to enemies with at least 3 debuffs. The effects are also doubled when the rare inflicts a debuff, so that will mean 8% crit rate and 24% crit damage. Anaxa's weakest implants are considered debuffs, so he will always have permanent uptime on the set. The set performs similar to Wave Strider, but is easier to use. If you happen to have Akron leftovers or just pieces lying around, this set could be worth considering. The last set is the Scholars of Lost Erudition set, which increases crit rate by 8%, increases skill and ult damage by 20%, and also deals 25% more damage on the next skill upon using ult. The set still offers substantial value, but is unfortunately the worst out of the 5 sets, and I would only use the set if you happen to have pieces lying around or can't really afford to farm other sets right now. So which set should you actually farm? If you only care about the best of the best performance, then it will obviously be Genius if you're able to prevent any overcapping to ensure you're still getting value. Otherwise, just use the Navigator set. However, there might be other factors at play. Perhaps you don't have the absolute best team for him. Perhaps your other characters are sharing the same support as Anaxa, or the Cavern in general is just terrible. For example, the Genius set Cavern is extremely inefficient, while the Scholar's Cavern shares a set with Sacerdos, so that makes it extremely efficient. Or you might have Mornax Blade, making farming the Navigator set a lot more efficient. Maybe you have leftovers from farming for Finon, and you don't want to spend so much time farming. In this case, I would say it depends. Just make sure the set you're farming aligns best with your goals. His planar set is quite simple though. His best in slot would just be the Rutinant Arena planar, which increases crit rate by 8%, and when crit rate is higher than 70%, basic and skill damage increases by 20%. This is the only set you should be farming for him as a DPS, realistically. Well, that was a bit long. but his sub DPS set is quite simple. Of course, you can still use any of the previous sets mentioned, but as a sub DPS, you generally want him to move as much as possible. In this case, the best set would be the 4-piece Ego set. This set increases wind damage by 10% and action advances the wearer by 25% upon ult, which he can fully utilize. This allows him to take more action and charge Herta faster. His planar set is pretty much still the same, but he has other options as well. You can use him on the Izumo set since he can now proc the passive being on the same team as Herta. Alternatively, you can use him on Lusaka to buff Herta or Vomvac for an earlier action. The Vomvac tech is a bit niche and I wouldn't recommend it unless you know what you're doing. I typically run mine on Lusaka as fast as possible, as his personal damage is quite negligible on Herta teams. I would really only use Vomvac if you're using it for Zero Cycle or cheating AV in APOC. His main stats would just be attack boots or speed boots depending on your goal, crit rate or crit damage body, attack orb, and attack rope. The sub-stats you want to focus are just attack percent, crit rate, crit damage, and however much speed you need for your team comp. If you're playing him on his absolute best team with Cyrene and Cyrene, his speed is actually quite irrelevant from my experience, especially if you're using him with RMC, as he would just be constantly pulled up by the action advance. However, if you're using him without Cyrene, you would typically want at least 134 speed in combat. This means 134 speed without Cyrene and 114 speed if you have Cyrene on the team, since she provides 20 speed. If you're playing him as a sub DPS, you want him to be as fast as possible. I typically have mine on 160 plus speed. Technically, wind damage orb works on him, but he gets more mileage for an attack orb. Just use whichever has better substats. For crit rate, you typically want as close as to 100% crit rate in combat, if possible. Remember that you need a minimum of 70% crit rate to use the Root to Them passive. Out of combat can depend on your teammate options. Sunday gives 20% crit rate, and RMC gives 10% crit rate. I typically have mine at 90 crit rate, so I have exactly 100% in combat with RMC. Try to aim at least 3.3k attack and 150 plus crit damage. Of course, performance can still vary. You can use verbals to check your damage. However, if you're playing him as a sub DPS, his crit ratio matters very little, unless you're using Rudenland. Your goal is to make him as fast as possible, so around 50 plus crit rate is usually enough, and around 80 plus crit damage would be good. You should still have roughly around 3k attack though. I'm going to briefly discuss his teammates' builds too. I'll really only talk about his biz team as that's what matters. For Cyrene, this is typically Eco Vomvac, since you want her to ult as soon as possible. Deliverer can technically work, but the bust from Deliverer usually isn't worth it for the slower uptime. Just make sure she has at least 180 speed, so she can properly buff the team. You can use the free Herta Shub Lightcone on her. Cyrene is usually on a Sacerdotal set with Lusaka. In certain scenarios, you can use Vomvac for faster AV or Zero Cycle clears, but I wouldn't really care about that if you don't care. There is an argument to be made for the Ego set, but I think you are losing out on too cmany buffs by that point. And extra Cyrene turns don't necessarily help since you cap at 8 stacks anyways. Make sure she has at least 140 speed out of combat so she can be 160 in combat. I'll typically use her on DDD over the free Lightcone we get from the restaurant event, since the more actions matter more than the extra attack buffs she can give. RMC would just be either 4-piece Deliver, 2-piece 2-piece speed, or 4-piece Ego, depending on your goal. His speed is also dependent on the mode, so just tweak it as you see fit. Downhand PT would just be on 4-piece Recluse and 2-piece Lusaka to buff Anaxa more. Alright, now let's discuss how to actually play him in the game, as he does require a bit more skill to pilot than your average DPS. Typically, before he charges his ult, you want to just basic, which should immediately charge it. I usually basic on Anaxa until Cyrene is charged, and only scale with him when he has both Peerage and the Cyrene buffs active. This allows me to always skill with Cyrene. Of course, sometimes it is beneficial to basic with Cyrene in certain scenarios if you want to avoid triggering Peerage early, like I did in my Flame Reaver clear. I'm a bit lazy to edit the video properly, so just go check out the video to see what I mean. If you have Herta Lightcone, you might be able to afford to skill more often though. You also almost always want to skill with Cyrene at the start until she charges her ult. Make sure you use all your ults before you pop Cyrene's ult, because she charges the entire team's ult. Using your ult on either Cyrene or Anaxa first makes negligible difference in general, but there are certain scenarios where you would prefer to use on one over the other. This is usually if you have RMC on the team. If you skill on Cyrene first, Mem will pull up Anaxa, then you can use Cyrene ult on Anaxa again to pull him up. Sometimes you want to ult on Anaxa first to make him stay ahead of Mem. Make sure to not ult as Anaxa until you're actually on his turn, as any action before then will bring Mem ahead of Anaxa, wasting the turn. By locking Mem below Anaxa, you can effectively let him move one more time. In practice, this means you ult on Anaxa first, wait until it's firmly on his turn, then ult one more time on Cyrene before doing your skill thing. You can lock Mem out in other scenarios as well in order to keep the action advanced. It doesn't have to be on the initial Cyrene ult. The only difference is you don't ult on Cyrene because, well, you already used it on her. Further expanding on this, you want to Mem just right so you can avoid both Mem and Cyrene pulling him up at the same time, because this effectively wastes a turn. I usually try to time Mem to pull him up when he doesn't have Peerage, and Cyrene ult when he does so he can receive the maximum buffs. A semi-niche tech is when Anaxa is about to do his Peerage skill, you can ult immediately on any other character right after he skills. That ult will be used after the third Anaxa skill. In certain scenario, this means you can snapshot one more instance of Cyrene buff, which I did in my Pure Fishing clear, or charge Cyrene ult a bit more since she gains energy when Anaxa attacks. Another thing is when you have 8 charges of Cyrene stacks and Cyrene buffs, snapshotting Cyrene ult will allow you to skill 6 times in a row while maintaining Cyrene buffs the entire time, since she will add 2 more charges, that adds up to 6 right before Anaxa's 4th skill. He would just skill 2 more times after that, with all the buffs active. However, there are drawbacks to doing this. If you just let the Peerage run its course, and then Cyrene ult and Cyrene ult again, you would do 4 more skills, which would total to 8 skills, instead of 6 if you did the previous tech, and 8 is more than 6. I would only use this tech if you're out of Cyrene ult, and doing this will let you clear the game then and there, so you don't waste AV or another cycle. If you're about to switch waves, you usually want to hold onto your ult so you can immediately proc his double skill onto the next wave. If you're using his S1, you would typically ult right before it is his turn so you can get the extra ER from his Lightcone passive. I was mainly talking about DPS, but for him as a sub DPS, the same logic kinda applies for the holding ult. You usually want to make sure you're using his ult to action advance himself with the ego. I will scale and basic depending on how well you're managing your skill point and how close you are to charging her ult. The same logic kinda applies to using his ult. You want to make sure you're getting maximum mileage on charging Herta ult for more Herta actions. Alright, that was kinda long. I had a lot to talk about him. He's still a very strong character in the endgame, except Pure Fiction, which he was never really that impressive in anyways. Of course, he can still full clear all of them at a baseline investment. At an E0 baseline, he aged surprisingly well, and is arguably better than E0 Final. No, in fact, he is better than E0 Final. His team is extremely cheap too, as you only need E0 Cyrene and E0 Cyrene without the need for any signature Lightcone. That's all I have to say about a Pharaoh Scholar. I hope you found this video entertaining and helpful. Please like and subscribe. It would mean a lot to me as I continue to make more Star Rail related content in the future.